and say welcome to you all to number 131 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk series. And today's topic is let's talk about the evolving languages of Pinot Noir with Meg Maker, our chair. I'd like to extend a welcome to those of you not members who haven't been to one of our events before, and also to those of you who are non-members. Just a bit of background. The Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK, but today has over 270 members, including wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional communicators. And the membership now is actually a 50-50 split between the UK and overseas. There's a lot more information about the Circle on our website, and you can also look into how you can apply to become a member. But without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Neil Holcoer, who's a member of the Circle, but attended, I believe, Meg's talk last year, and he's very kindly agreed to introduce Meg today. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you. There will be two introductions. I'll explain why in a minute. From July 10th to 12th, 2025, a group of about 60 interdisciplinary researchers and industry representatives from around the world gathered at St. Cross College, Oxford, for the Pinot Noir Project's inaugural event, the Pinot Noir and Identity Symposium. In addition to me, attendees included four other Circle members: Dominique Buckwell, Graham Harding, who was one of the organizers, Judy O'Kane, and today's speaker, Meg Maker, whom I met for the first and still only time in person, sadly. Meg is an American writer and artist curious about nature, food, wine, and place. Her work explores wine and food as expressions of social and cultural identity and how these manifest history, tradition, and fashion. She's particularly interested in how wine became modern and how makers have continually reinvented it to fit evolving tastes and technologies. Her current research focuses on wine languages and how our linguistic choices reinforce or explode notions of individual identity and wine's place in culture. Meg has academic training in fine art, creative writing, cultural history, ecology, botany, and life sciences, and earned bachelor's and master's degrees from Dartmouth. Her award-winning writing and illustrations have appeared in trade and lifestyle outlets and in her own publication, Maker's Table. She lives in New Hampshire. Today, Meg will share the presentation she gave at the Oxford Symposium, The Evolving Languages of Pinot Noir. I took this introduction and submitted it to Gemini, and this is what I got. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Our journey to today's seminar actually began last summer at St. Cross's College, Oxford. I was joined there by several fellow Circle members, Dominique Buckwell, Graham Harding, and Judy O'Kane, where we attained the inaugural Pinot Noir and Identity Symposium. It was there that I first met today's speaker in person. Meg Maker is an American writer and artist whose work sits at the fascinating intersection of nature, culture, and place. With an academic background ranging from fine art and cultural history to ecology and life science, Meg brings a truly interdisciplinary lens to our craft. She is particularly known for her award-winning publication, Maker's Table, where she explores how wine serves as an expression of social identity. Currently, her research dives deep into the very thing we all use every day, wine language. She is examining how the words we choose can either reinforce or challenge wine's place in our culture. Today, Meg is here to share the presentation she delivered at the Oxford Symposium titled The Evolving Language of Pinot Noir. Please join me in welcoming from New Hampshire, Meg Maker.
Oh, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Gemini, parent company Alphabet. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm going, without further ado, to dive into my presentation. So just one moment. I'll share my screen. Okay, you should be seeing, if I'm not mistaken, the cover slide. Is that correct? Yes?
Yeah, all
Uh-oh.
good. All good, Meg.
Yeah, all good. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. So, thank you so much again. I've written and spoken, as you've just heard, about the evolving languages of wine over the last several years, including a presentation to the Circle in 2023. I first presented this, as Neil said, in July of 25. And that symposium convened researchers and independent scholars and winemakers for 3 days of discussion about this characterful grape. And for that, I produced a long research paper, about 7,000 words. And that is forthcoming in World of Fine Wine in March. But for the conference itself, I presented this short slide deck, which I've modified slightly since then. And that's what today's presentation is based on. So all languages evolve. Their vocabularies and vernaculars, enjoying cycles of emergence, expansion, standardization, modernization, and reinvention. And such a cycle has radically transformed wine discourse in English over the last half century. During the early to mid 20th century, wine writing principally attended to wine's provenance and its typicity. Writers trained their lens on wine's cultural and geographic origins, its social versus its hedonic signature, its character versus its flavor. Wine writing was principally evaluative, the critic rendering judgments based on their earned expertise and domain knowledge. In her 1975 paper, Talking About Wine, the linguist Adrienne Lehrer defines evaluative language, which I just mentioned, as expressing high praise, low praise, mild derogation, and condemnation. So that's through use of words like elegant, fine, great, subtle, insipid, ordinary, and ghastly. That's her words. So that's evaluative language. As the century progressed and as globalization expanded access to the world's wines, demand rose for detailed insights to support connoisseurship. Wine commentary began to emphasize wine's flavor and olfactory impressions, and the writing suddenly bloomed with metaphors. Wine writing became more descriptive versus evaluative, the critic populating notes with words to catalog their hedonic experience. So Lehrer defines descriptive language as that which expresses specific flavor, aroma, or other organoleptic properties. So her examples included oaky, woody, chalky, mineral, fruity, nutty, spicy, flowery, and herbal, among many more. So the descriptive approaches deviated from the older forms that emphasized wine's cultural signature and leaned instead into the impressions it made on the individual taster. So it was a shift from origin to experience, from what is this wine about to what is this wine about to me. So as this descriptive style grew fashionable, it began to morph. One style, advanced by academics and wine credentialing organizations, relied on structured vocabularies, systems of descriptors that allowed a taster to detail a wine's sensory impact free of subjective connotations. The goal was to arm industry professionals and connoisseurs alike with tools to ensure consistent and objective commentary. Another style was more affective and poetic. It was embraced by wine critics and popular commentators, and it swiftly drove demand for highly rated wines. Lavishly inventive, it emphasized wine's subjective over objective truths, and some critics rose to prominence championing the style. So these descriptive approaches followed each other more or less in sequence, one learning from the next, but they weren't mutually exclusive. Writers mixed and matched tactics to suit circumstances and moods. But each style reflected a slightly different perspective about wine and its cultural significance, and especially about the relationship between the taster and the tasted. So in this talk, we follow these evolutions using Pinot Noir as a lens through which to view shifts in these lexical and linguistic choices. But first, a little bit of history. After repeal of Prohibition in 1933, Americans were newly re-exposed to wine, and many were flummoxed. The wine industry had difficulty winning customers. Some books appeared to try to persuade and educate, but many were marred with errors, really, quote, laughably bad, according to the American wine historian Thomas Pinney, who argued that much of their effect was, unfortunately, to produce wine snobbery, that child of ignorance wedded to anxiety, and just as much to perpetuate misconceptions and misinformation. James Thurber's 1937 cartoon, on the slide, first appeared in The New Yorker. It shows two couples at a table raising glasses of dark wine, and the host's pronouncement about the wine seems at first like a simple send-up of wine speak, but a second reading reveals he's actually disparaging the wine and wine snobbery along with it. It didn't help that wine was more associated with Europe than America. Alec Waugh, British novelist and the elder brother of Evelyn Waugh, noted that the nomenclature of wine, most of it based on the French, was freely used. There was talk of goutte de paille, a musty straw-like flavor, a goutte de pien à fusil, a flinty taste to be found in Chablis. There were words like corsé, meaning full-blooded. Velouté, velvety, was a term of recommendation, but fruité was not, he said. So it's no wonder people stuck to what they knew, cocktails and highballs. The language of wine was the language of territory, and this added to Americans' confusion. We're notoriously bad at geography. Americans unfamiliar with the concept of terroir and the place centricity of European wine were encouraged instead to learn the language of flavor in order to personalize the experience of tasting, so that way any wine, and perhaps especially any American wine, could be experienced and enjoyed without the baggage of territorial and geopolitical associations. But nonetheless, the market was soon awash in American-grown wines with fanciful names appropriated from European geography. In 1964, Ian J. Gallo Winery, which had been founded by brothers Ernest and Julio in Sonoma, California, just after repeal, introduced a red wine they called Hearty Burgundy. It was Burgundian only in name, a blended wine. It was made from grapes grown in California's North Coast and Central Valley, principally Petit Syrah, Zinfandel, and Carignan. The blend has always been proprietary. They packaged it in 1.5-liter glass jugs, and it's still sold today, although now in standard Magnum bottles, which cost about $12. Gallo, incidentally, also introduced a companion white they called Mountain Chablis, likewise sold in jugs in a blend of grapes, principally Colombard, Chenin Blanc, and in a modest tip of the hat to the original Chardonnay. So as a fanciful name, Hearty Burgundy wasn't explanatory, it was evocative. The reference leveraged Americans' vague, indistinct familiarity with France to elevate the wine's status, essentially arrogating Frenchness for credibility. And hearty was a fully American idea. Burgundy did not view itself as robust and inky, but this new wine married an American ideal of strength and individuality with a French ideal of purity and refinement. So in the marriage, this hearty wine took the French surname Burgundy, and soon that signifier, Burgundy, came to mean a fine red wine that was made in America. So the 1960s and 70s saw increasing American interest in world cuisines, and cooks and cookbook authors rose to meet the moment. Julia Child, Joyce Chen, Madhur Jaffrey, and Marcella Hazen published their specialized cookbooks during this period. American importers sprang up to bring the world's wines into the country and get them onto the tables of adventures from home gastronomes. Robert Haas launched vineyard brands. Kermit Lynch, Wilson Daniels, Becky Wasserman, they all started importing in that decade too. Publications also sprang up to address interest in gastronomy and connoisseurship and furnish American consumers with information, tips, and advice. The New York Times started a wine column. The Wine Spectator, The Wine Advocate, and Wine Enthusiast magazines began, and such consumer writing aimed to educate, enlighten, encourage exploration, stimulate thirst, and to prompt a sale. To do so, it needed to be accessible and readable, friendly, warm, and engaging, and it needed to assume limited prior knowledge of or experience with wine. So it was a watershed moment in wine commentary. Writers responded to the new demands according to their own editorial, philosophical, and aesthetic bents. Some writers, especially those who had been writing about wine for some time, held firm to older prototypes. Others began to explore ways to make wine evaluation and assessment a more rigorous exercise, developing formal lexicons and vocabularies. And then there was a third cohort. They were playful. They aimed to reach audiences' hearts and minds with more inventive language. So let's turn to these three styles. The first were what I call the classicists. Their writing inherited the sensibility of European and British wine commentary, which attended to the wine's typicity and geography. An evaluative style, it emphasized a wine's overall character. Many adherents actively derided metaphor and inventive descriptors, and there was limited discussion of flavor, except when necessary to call out a singular distinguishing feature of a bottle, site, or vintage. Commentary often aimed to personify wine, to make it a living entity with its own history and integrity. The language was spare, formal, and restrained. As we see in this excerpt, note in particular how few flavor descriptors appear in the passages, and how these French producers, as interviewed by Gerald Asher, use terms we might normally apply to fellow humans. Such personification of the wine rendered it a living entity, a peer to whom one can relate, even a friend with whom one may converse. So the wine was a character with enduring attributes, plus qualities that shift according to mood and weather, in the second case quite literally. But the wine was not esoteric or rarefied. The wine wasn't really even a thing. It was a neighbor. Here's another classicist, Émile Pinot. I'm holding up his book for anyone who's looking at my face and not the screen slide. Émile Pinot was a French enologist and the author of the seminal book Le Goût du Vin, Taste of Wine, from 1980. He really disliked metaphorical language, believing it drew attention away from the tasted and wrongly toward the taster. Frank Parle was a wine critic at the New York Times for over 30 years. He derided wine speak. In fact, he used that term, maybe even coined it, I don't know, and was parsimonious writer who focused principally on producers and their through lines. He might describe a wine as chunky or having bright, spicy flavors, but taste was not his principal concern. Although he frequently wrote about Pinot Noir, particularly from Burgundy, Oregon, and California, I had to rummage extensively in the Times archives to find any adjectives describing these wines. This was the best I could do. Lighter style or richer style, good wines, solid, well-made, and tasty. But soon there was a response from what I call the scientists. So Maynard Amarine, who worked at UC Davis until 1973, published with colleague Edward Rossler, Wines, Their Sensory Evaluation, on their work to standardize wine language. The book was aimed at the connoisseur as well as the professional. Their project reacted against what they viewed as the romanticism, their word, of contemporary wine discourse. In 1974, after Amarine retired, Ann Noble joined the faculty at UC Davis. Noble, a sensory researcher, was likewise frustrated by the imprecision, in her view, of contemporary wine tasting notes, and how those terms telegraph meaning to consumers or didn't. Interviewed in 2014, she recalled that at that time, wine experts, this is a quote, wine experts would describe wines with words such as harmonious, elegant, round, and balanced. I felt these non-specific terms created an unnecessary mystique around wine. Consumers would feel intimidated. They had no idea how to identify a good wine, or a wine they liked, or if a wine they liked was in fact good. Noble set about to develop a standardized set of terms that were analytical and free of hedonic or value judgment connotations. That was her words. Her approach diverged from Amarine's in its focus on wine's aromatic properties. She used chemical and analytical sensory techniques to develop a three-tiered system of aroma descriptors. At the top were broad terms like fruity, floral, or earthy, which then branched into secondary and tertiary terms, and she arrayed them in a circle to form what we all know as the aroma wheel. She published the first edition in 1984 and then updated it in 1987. Noble's final wheel contained 83 descriptive terms. It was a lexicon reliant on analogy. If one were to use the aroma wheel to describe a Burgundian Pinot Noir, one might arrive at what's on the slide. The wheel encouraged rigor and precision, but its reliance on flavor analogies meant it was fundamentally a descriptive versus evaluative strategy. It called upon the taster to evaluate their hedonic impressions, a departure from the traditionalist evaluative strategy that allowed broader character strokes. So this system and all the wine lexicons that followed regarded wine as an object whose aesthetic truths could be evaluated and described objectively, provided the framework was rigorously followed. So there's no clove in Pinot Noir, the wine smells like cloves, and there's no raspberry in Pinot Noir, the wine tastes like raspberry. So the wine is objectified in relation to these other objects. The Wine and Spirit Education Trust, or WSET, launched in the UK in 1969, and it soon expanded to other countries. It entered the US only in 1994. The WSET still trains new wine professionals, and it is, of course, the path to Master of Wine credential. To support pedagogy, they developed a proprietary tasting system called the Systematic Approach to Tasting, or SAT. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It breaks the evaluation of wine into assessment of appearance, nose, palate, and conclusion. And for direct palate impressions of like sweetness, acidity, tannin, alcohol, and body, students are instructed to use generalized value scale. Low, medium minus, medium, medium plus, high. But for primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas and flavors, WSET provides a lexicon of terms, which at level 4 contains about 100 flowers, fruits, herbs, spices, baked goods, and a few aromatic but inedible items. So using WSET L4 grid, a taster might describe a Courton Burgundy this way on the slide. So the WSET does provide a disclaimer to students at the foot of the grid, noting that it's designed to be a prompt, and memorization of specific words isn't required to pass tests. Quote, the examiners will accept other descriptors so long as they are accurate, unquote. Meaning, presumably, a flavor analogy they expect. For example, they might accept boysenberry for the Courton, but not cucumber. And they almost certainly would not accept graceful, wild, savage, reticent, stony, rude, robust, rustic, or violent, terms that Courton producers use themselves, which we saw on the earlier slide. The WSET form proliferated as people entering the wine trade took courses and trained using the SAT. So here's an example of a recent tasting note by American Samantha Cole Johnson. She's a Circle member as well. She's a reviewer for JancesRobinson.com. It's from a roundup of under $30 Pinot Noirs from Oregon, and this wine is from Winters Hill. But basically, this was a needle drop. I kind of plucked it at random. So Cole Johnson holds a WSET diploma and has completed some parts of the Masters of Wine program, and her brief tasting notes follow some of the lexical conventions of the WSET. This is her lingua franca, after all. And the note is emblematic of that structured systematic style, right? Readably brief, populated by a few colorful analogies, like cinnamon graham crackers, for example. It does, however, assume some familiarity with the professional terms of art. For example, media, medium plus, forward, and new world. This systematic approach, now decades old, is prevalent across media. So it would not be novel for avid readers of wine commentary, but it's not especially descriptive or engaging for those new to the category. Both the WSET and the aroma wheel are heavily analogous, as we've seen. They're populated with mostly organic materials that served as references for the aromas and flavors the taster sensed in the wine. Notably, the standard descriptors are in English. They're aimed at English speakers, and they're based on European foods and plants and flavors. Richard Hemming, Master of Wine, calls this Winglish. But only 15 to 17% of the world's population speaks English. So the bodies that had created these lexicons created a dominant vocabulary, but not necessarily a shared vocabulary. Problematically, the lexicons, at least originally, required familiarity with these reference flavors to pass exams. And when Tinashe Noah Mudoka, a Zimbabwean sommelier and now winemaker in South Africa, first began to study wine, he had to do mental gymnastics to write the correct so-called European fruit on the exam. So ditto when formal tasting grids found their footing in Asia. They got transliterated into local flavors. But those modifications didn't really explode the paradigm. They just mapped it to a different botanical vocabulary. So the third style of commentary was artful, poetic. So Robert M. Parker Jr., a lawyer from Maryland, had no formal training in wine when he launched his newsletter, The Wine Advocate, in 1978. In fact, Parker was resolutely a wine industry outsider who sought to bring opinions about wines to consumers free of commercial bias. Parker's prose was heavily descriptive and highly inventive, with a clear emphasis on the wine's olfactory and flavor sensibilities. We can see that in two reviews issued in the same edition of the 85 La Tâche and Grand Cru from Romanée Conti. There are noun analogies, spices, flowers, and truffles, but the writing, I feel, is animated more vividly by use of adjectives and adverbs like penetrating, sublime, opulent, concentrated, dazzling, exquisite. So Parker was a poet of wine. Parker's writing is emblematic of a shift in the wine narrative, specifically in what or who plays the leading role. So older forms put the wine into the center of the frame, remarking on its character and typicity, as we saw. The Burgundian producers didn't need to describe the flavor of a wine because it was an established character, a type. They didn't need to describe it. That character and type varied mostly according to place, age, and aging. They knew what the wine was like. And so often did their rarefied audience. Meanwhile, those new to wine, especially consumers who lacked a historical, geographic, and traditionalist reference frame, needed something to grasp onto as they dragged themselves toward understanding, whether of a Courtin or a Hardy Burgundy, right? A consumer might ask, well, what does it taste like? And when the answer was an analogy, cherries, the consumer might make a connection. And when the answer was an analogy decorated with lavish metaphor, they might actually make a purchase. And purchase they did. So Parker's high Baroque voice, first popularized in the 80s and 90s, was swiftly emulated by marketers, and it remains the dominant style. Today, many wine review publications make their tasting databases available to statisticians and modelers to support academic research. So linguist Kevin Capehart of Cal State Fresno evaluated a wine enthusiast database of 120,000 reviews of wines between $5 and $200. So this is based on. And he found that the tasting notes using words like bright, fresh, pink, juicy, pizza, and tasty were associated with less expensive wines, while notes with words like intense, velvety, boysenberry, old tobacco, truffle, steak, and vintage were associated with pricier wines. And tasting notes for cheaper wines were also shorter overall. I mean, to be fair, there's less to say. But the existence of expensive and cheap words like this makes intuitive sense to anyone who has been following along for the last few decades. One could hardly imagine Robert Parker describing a Romanée Conti La Tâche as tasty and good for pizza. So here are 5 different tasting notes on the same wine, and I challenge you to tell the difference between them. One of them is actually from the producer. This is the 2021 Thea's Selection Pinot Noir from Lemelson Vineyards, producer in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. And it's a wine actually I'm quite familiar with. That's why I chose this particular wine. The notes are nearly indistinguishable, albeit alike in style, if not substance. Some writers got smoke, others wild herbs. There's some agreement on tea and salt and cherry, although one person's red cherries and others black. Some of the descriptors are wildly inventive, like marshmallows toasted over a smoky campfire, freshly shucked oysters. A consumer wondering what does this wine taste like is left with a bewildering grab bag of analogies that seem to contradict one another, ironically only serving to underscore the subjectivity of the tasting exercise. Over time, some linguistic tropes about Pinot Noir have emerged. We see them everywhere in the literature, whether the writing's about Chambolle Musigny or Meiomi. Here are a few, right? Pinot Noir is feminine. Gendered metaphors are always troubling, and this one drags in connotations of shyness, delicacy, even fragility. On the other hand, we saw examples of Burgundy producers describing their wines as masculine, assertive, violent, and savage. Pinot Noir is elegant, seductive, and sublime. Perhaps some Pinots read like that, but for consumers of supermarket brands, it's functionally just Pinot, a reliably fruity, not too tannic partner for whatever else is on their table. Pinot Noir is sensitive. This is perhaps the most ubiquitous trope, stemming in part from the grape's physiological properties, thin skin leading to rot and other calamities. But the grape's genetic fecundity and adaptability have allowed it to thrive not only in its native Burgundy, but also in California, Oregon, New Zealand, Germany, Japan, and beyond. Instead of sensitive, it might be better characterized as cunningly adaptable, even robust. The point is that writers can easily fall into the trap of repeating, even amplifying these cliches. So fast forward to today. William Kelly, as many of you know, is current editor-in-chief of Robert Parker's Wine Advocate. He also makes wine in Burgundy himself. Kelly's voice is quieter than Parker's, writing about the same wine, albeit much later vintage. He uses analogous terms like raspberry, rose petal, peony, and blood orange, and modifiers, kaleidoscopic, effortless, and unremitting. Plus, there are glimmers of that evaluative characterization, stunningly complete, pristinely delicate, and elegant. He uses also some of the WSET terminology, medium to full-bodied, for example. So his style could best be described as inventive but tilting toward postmodernism, a commingling of classicist scientific and artful perspectives. It's appropriative in a way. And language continues to evolve. Jermaine Stone is an American wine educator, producer, and impresario. He is former wine buyer and logistics manager for Zacky's, and he later founded his own wine branding and marketing agency, Crew Love Selections. He's passionate about both wine and popular music, and he combines them artfully in his work. He has a particular love of Burgundy. He calls himself the lost son of Burgundy, and has covered Pinot Noir extensively in short and long form video for his YouTube channel. He has met with Pinot Noir producers in their vineyards and cellars, taking it from the Bronx to Burgundy for his series Tasting Notes from the Streets. He was also part of a successful event last fall in Burgundy, Vin et Hip Hop, which slides, we have slides from that on the slide. A big party coordinated with Domaine de Jacques and Claude Vougeot, where the wines were decidedly not the focus. Stone regularly pairs wine with hip-hop music. In one video, he considers a music pairing for Fat Bastard Pinot Noir. Sampling the wine, he describes it this way: elegant, smooth, it's got some weight to it, juicy cherry, soft spice. You can read the slide. He came up with a Missy Elliott song, Sock It To Me, to pair with this wine, that they were temperamentally similar. So here, Stone nods to some prototypes that we've seen, but he's also inventing new expressions. He's descriptive, he's evaluative, and he's also inventive. And I think it's through holistic gestures like these that Pinot Noir and wine commentary itself can move forward. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll stop sharing. And I hope there are questions.
Thank you very much, Meg. Yes, well, there's Patricia's put a few comments in there. Patricia, would you like to unmute yourself and just have a chat with Meg here?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, actually, Meg, you've read a lot of the stuff I write, and I have this idea that combining the various styles of writing about wine is actually the right way to go. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. You've hit on it. I want to hear more about what you have to say about that.
Well, I don't
say
know.
more about your stance.
I think that both aromas, flavors, even color, but also structure and fun are relevant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fun.
When you say fun, what do you mean by fun? Do you mean the context? Do you mean the experience of the wine?
The experience.
Mm-hmm.
It ought to. Wine is not. It's supposed to be fun. I mean, whatever fun means to different people. It might
Sure.
be the experience of a posh black tie dinner in the city that for some people is fun. Or it
Mhm.
might be having a picnic on a beach, which might be fun. But I think that trying to combine the aromas, flavors, and structure, and dare I say it, even going beyond that, to the experience, which you've mentioned, with different people and different wines,
Mhm.
is relevant to how wine should fit. I know I'm coming out of an English background rather
Mhm.
than an American background. So maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick here.
Well, no, I think you're onto something. I'm seeing a lot more discussion about how we need to kind of unfreight wine of the assumptions about the ceremonies and rituals within which we normally would introduce wine, right? The wedding, the party, the dining, fine dining experience, whatever it is, that it makes it kind of pigeonholes wine to be used only in certain contexts. And there's a lot of work being done, and I think what Jermaine Stone and others um, are doing to try to bring wine into experiences and activities that are already ongoing. They're basically introducing wine into a context where it wasn't necessarily even welcome before. And it doesn't it means that the wine is not the focal point. It's not the focus of attention. But I agree. I think that that's what we need to do if we're going to continue to want, if wine's going to continue to be culturally relevant, it needs to meet culture where culture is. Are there other comments or questions?
Um,
I can
Trevor, he said he has a question about the audiences.
Yes, hello, thanks.
Hi.
Uh, Meg, I love your historical review because all of this is new to me. You just used the word context, which is, I think, what I mean by audiences. And I think it explains and perhaps sort of takes the heat out of a lot of this debate. If you try to understand who these different people that you've mentioned in your history and later in your speech, who they were actually trying to address. You, in your speech, were addressing your symposium originally and now us, and it's a particular language and very appropriate. The WSET language, I know you're a bit harder on that than I am. It's designed for students to address their examiners and teachers, I suppose, to demonstrate something, not to sell the wine, but to show that they understand what the various organoleptic and structural properties of wine are. And therefore, it's going to be descriptive, and it would be wrong to use watermelon for Pinot Noir, perhaps, and so I think that's appropriate there. Then there's the whole question of how you sell wine, supermarket shelves and reviews in decanter and that sort of stuff. I think it's another language, and I, being a sort of scientist, would segment all of these different ways of describing wine according to whether they're appropriate for the context, for the audience. Any comment?
Target context. Yeah, no, I think that's really well said, Trevor. Actually, I totally agree with you. And I think we often forget whom we're writing for, especially, you're banging out 30 tasting notes and you can fall back on, a certain way that you've been writing about wine for a long time. I've had to really reflect hard on what am I trying to say and what am I trying to do? And one of the things as a journalist, I'm not actually trying to convince anyone to buy the wine. I think a lot of wine journalism and wine tasting notes that people here on the call tend to produce, they have a little bit of a salesy flavor sometimes. And I'm a little skeptical of that because I don't know how much we need to work on behalf of the producer to encourage a sale of the wine. Our words are going to end up using, if we're positive and flattering toward a wine, they're going to be end up used that way. But I do think that there's a really great paper by a guy. His last name is James. He's done a lot of work on what the the colorful, more floral language tasting note has done to the market. Basically, how Noble and Parker moved the market, moved into marketing speak and into persuasive speech about wine. And I'm I'm hesitant to participate in that myself, because I'm not trying to encourage anyone to buy the wine that I've reviewed. I want to share my authentic experience of it. And so I tend to use a mix of languages. And I try to write for someone who may have some understanding of wine, but may not have really a very deep understanding of wine. But I think we each have to really understand, if you have a column in Tasting Panel magazine, it's going to be really different from a column in, the Financial Times, right? In terms of who your audience is. And sometimes your editor can help you with that as well.
Mm-hmm. So do you think do you think people are going back to the original, the classicist way of writing about wine? Is it going to be a mix of how it's all evolved, or is it a way of now having to introduce the cultures and what people should be, or the experiences that people should have when they're drinking the wine, or can have when they're drinking the wine?
I see a mix of things happening. I see that there's a diminishing appetite for what people call like the fruit salad or the tutti frutti tasting note, because a lot of people think it sounds kind of absurd and it reads as absurd. And as we saw with those 5 examples of the Thea Selection Pinot Noir, they're not, it doesn't help you determine what that tastes like, really. So I think that a more personalized, evaluative approach can be really valuable. Like, I think if I've tasted 30 Oregon Pinot Noirs and someone says, well, which ones of these do you admire most? And I can say, well, these 5. That's really kind of enough in a way. I don't need to necessarily describe, well, this one has a little bit more cherry and this one has a little bit more strawberry. Like, that's not going to help people so much. But being able to sort of render a subjective opinion on the wine, I think, is really quite valuable. And then again, as I said from the start, from the top of the chat here, that I think that introducing wine into other occasions and then not requiring people necessarily to describe their experience, but just have the experience and say evaluatively whether it was good or bad for them, I think is sometimes, you have a party and there's 8 wines open, say, and the one that goes first is the one that's the right wine for that occasion, right? And no one's had to say anything about it except, pour me more.
It's a simpler way to understand, isn't it?
It's a simpler way to understand how the crowd is viewing the wines.
There's Jeffrey Burrows. Jeffrey, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thanks. Hi, Meg.
Hi, how are you? Hi.
Good. So I don't consider myself a critic when I write about wines. I do use the WSET vernacular, and then I add on observations. And I often have the opportunity to taste sample wines that I don't particularly care for because of style, not because of quality. And so more recently, I've tried to say things like, well, if you like Big Napa Cabernet Sauvignon, this wine will appeal to you. But it's just kind of that trying to write to a wide variety of customers or people who might be reading your material. I just wonder if it's possible to speak to everybody.
I don't think so. How can you? I mean, I'm speaking from my cultural perspective, my training, my background, white Northern New Englander. And I think that, what I'm trying to look at now in my work is other commentators from other cultural vantage points to see how they're coming at it. Like I'm looking at Regine Rousseau, who's really interesting American. She was originally born in the Caribbean. She's polylingual. She's doing this really interesting thing where she'll taste a wine and then she'll write a fictional anecdote about it, and then she'll then explicate why she chose that. And it's a really interesting combination of forms that I think kind of expands and explodes the way we can talk and think about wine. There's been a lot of conversation among various people, urgent and necessary conversation about Eurocentricity and colonialist bias in the way we talk about wine. And, I'm trying to be a listener to that because obviously I don't have certain standing that other people do. But no, I think the point is not to say there is a one right and wrong way, but to really let 1,000 flowers bloom. Yeah.
Sure. I think you had mentioned Germain. I
Yeah.
think it's really interesting to get such a different point of view, um, to kind of make us wake up sometimes.
Hmm. Yeah, I just think the more different voices we have describing their experience of wine, bringing their cultural understanding, their cultural histories to the experience of wine and bringing their own language to it, applying their own language. I've advocated for diversity and personalization. So we need more different voices and we need them to bring their own vocabularies and languages to the experience. We want to talk about wine because talking about wine is a way we make some understanding about it, the way we can share our experience with we can share our physical experience with others or aesthetic experience. It's natural to want to talk about wine. And a lot of people think I'm anti-tasting note. I am absolutely not anti-tasting note. I love tasting notes. I write tasting notes. They're useful in many ways, but we can also get a little bit bogged down in them when we say this is the right form and this is not the right form because other people they don't think in that way. They don't think objectively or analytically, etc. So Liz has her hand up.
Just quickly though, I think Frederick Keppel, I've just asked him to
Oh,
unmute.
okay.
He made
Great.
a comment about his views of Parker's notes. Off you go, Frederick.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Hi, Frederick.
okay. When Parker uses words like surreal and celestial, and that sort of thing, yeah, I always found that. I mean, I read Parker religiously, to use an extravagant term,
Yeah.
but I was always put off by the extremity of his language, and I wondered how the people who were his followers, so to speak, how much that influenced how they felt about their own tasting of wine. I mean, if you pour out some big California Cabernet and you're looking for a surreal and celestial experience, and if it doesn't follow, does that somehow make
Yeah.
the wine invalid for you?
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's super interesting. There's, I think, a lot of anchoring, to use the marketing term, anchoring. If you're going to look for, if I hand you a glass of wine, I say, there's a lot of cherry in this wine, you're going to go, oh yeah, I get cherry. I think also if with Parker, it'd be like, this is celestial, it's ethereal, it's transcendental. And then you hand me a glass of that wine, this is transcendental. And I think, okay, I have to somehow find a
Right, yeah.
transcendental moment in the wine. But I also think that Parker's prose becomes quite performative. If you read, like you can see over my shoulder, you can see all his books, right? It becomes, it's like he's performing taste. He's performing the exercise of description. And so I think to keep himself interested, he used these sort of lavish, prose and the thesaurus. It's almost the David Foster Wallace kind of effect in a way. Like lawyers tend to be really good writers. They tend to be very intelligent, very smart, very verbal people. That's how they succeed in their craft and their trade. And I know a lot of really good writers who are lawyers and vice versa. But
more and more people are writing about wine now. I mean, look at Substack. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just exploding with people
Yeah.
who are writing about wine. And there gets to be, I hate to use the word competition. I mean, we're all in this together. But at the same time, you want people to come to your Substack and your website and rely on you and
Right.
hopefully subscribe to your website. And so it does become a sort of a performance.
Exactly.
This is the way I write about wine. Here is how I describe wine.
Exactly.
Read it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you have a very strong voice. You're a very consistent voice. Your writing is you have beautiful, very evocative descriptions of the wine, and I've always admired it. And it's a style, and I think others have different styles, more staccato or less descriptive entirely, much more about, again, provenance and typicity or something. And so it really is up to the reader, especially with that inflorescence of self-publishers, to find a voice they admire and like. And, you think about somebody like Hugh Johnson and, or Gerald Asher back in the day, these older writers, these prototypes that we were just looking at, and people would follow a particular voice because they trusted that voice. And when I think, Frederick, you brought up the question of, the mercantile aspect of the tasting note, and you start feeling a little suspicious of, what am I being sold when I read this?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Frederick.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Sure. Thank you.
Did you say Liz had a hand up, Liz?
Liz
Yes,
did.
I did. And in fact, Meg, you've almost made the point that I was about to make, which
Okay.
was to share something which the great Andrew Jefford wrote a long time ago, that as far as the consumer is concerned, the consumer of wine writing, it's like theatre criticism. You find a critic whose taste you like, you follow that critic. It doesn't matter exactly how that critic writes. It's somebody who shares your taste.
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah, in fact, I read the New Yorker cover to cover every week, as don't have a life, but I always read the critics, and there are certain critics that, whatever Adam Gopnik's writing about, I'm going to read it. I don't care if I have zero interest in the thing that he's been covering or have zero experience with it. I'm going to read it because I like his worldview. I like his take on things, and I always learn something that's outside of the particular topic. And I think this comes back to like topic versus subject, because I think sometimes we forget it's more than just giving the tasting notes on the wine, right? Whatever we're writing has to be about more than just the wine itself. It has to be about something larger than that. And that can be really tough if it's just a weekly column where you're supposed to recommend 10 wines or something. But I think that's where the work comes in. Not so much describing the wine as describing why the wine matters and why the reader should read the column at all.
Thank you. I think Havard Flatland has got a question, or he's put a comment in the chat. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, go ahead, Havard.
Yes, I was thinking about a way of describing wine as putting in context and relation to other similar wines, like if you're describing, let's say, Chambol Musigny, you could say that it's Chambol Musigny leaning more towards Maurice Saint-Denis or the coarser properties of Chevret Chambertin, and typical of this producer, it has, for example, a whole cluster included, and coming from this very light vintage, it has a typical darker fruit flavor that you might find a bit strange, as it is a light vintage. So you're putting it into context of geography and vintage and style. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I would call the classicist style. That's the way that the writers of yore, the 50s, the 40s, would write about people writing in English. I'm not fluent enough in French to read the French commentary, but they would do that, and it assumes quite a bit of understanding, because when you're comparing, Chambol to Gevrey, or can't remember your example, you have to kind of already have a little bit of a mental picture about the differences between those and the character, the type, not necessarily the specific flavors, the specific flavor analogies that inhere in each of those, because it's kind of all Pinot Noir from Burgundy, right? It's not going to taste like a Syrah from the Northern Rhone. It's not going to taste like, Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough. But I think that is the kind of classicist style where it doesn't assume some knowledge, and it is very much a geography based way to view the wine, as opposed to centering it on the person's palate, right? So it's a good example, I think, of the classicist style.
Yeah. Yeah, very good way to look at it as well. We've probably got only a couple of minutes, but Neil, you mentioned something about address a question that Gemini came up with. So we've maybe got a minute.
When I was running the introduction through Gemini, a whole conversation began, and it asked if I wanted some icebreaker questions. So there are 4. I can present them if you're interested.
We've probably got time for a couple to see how.
Okay, well, let me start on modernization. Meg, you've noted an interest in how wine has been reinvented to fit evolving technologies. In your research on Pinot Noir, did you find that changes in winemaking technology led to a specific shift in the vocabulary writers use to describe it?
Well, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think that when I talk about evolving technologies, it's really how wine making has become modern and postmodern, so much more technological intervention in field and cellar to create a much more, honestly, sometimes sterilized, sometimes stable product. I think that in terms of Pinot Noir, it may mean a little more, it could be a little more sanitized. Pinot Noir has also become, because it's a slightly finicky grape to grow in certain regions, it has also become mass market. Of course, we saw with, after Sideways, we saw Merlot go into the toilet and Pinot Noir become out of the faucet. And so I think there was a lot of people who wanted a Pinot Noir, and they wanted something that was reliable and fruity and not too challenging. So I think that, the producers responded by producing lakes of this sort of banal, but at least Pinot-based product that was, reasonably affordable. So I think that's how technology influenced that. And then you have very little you can say about it because it's not very interesting, right? It's a $12 bottom shelf Pinot. I'm not sure exactly that's what Gemini had in mind.
I think you've got Gemini there. I think you've answered their question, Meg. Or its question,
I have one more that
we haven't really got time.
Says on identity and jargon, you mentioned that language can reinforce or explode identity. For those of us writing for the public, where is the line between using professional insider language that builds credibility and using language that might accidentally exclude certain readers? I think you addressed a lot of this, but
I think we did talk about that. Yeah, I think that you just really have to know your reader. And you do need to know, one thing I want to say is I think in wine writing, we have to show our hand. We have to show how we know what we know. We have to prove to the reader that we have standing, that we understand, that we have standing in the dialogue. And so that's how we earn the reader's trust, and not so much through use of jargon or complex language. I mean, you read Eric Asimov writing in the New York Times. If he uses a term of art from wine, he's going to explain it in a little tiny scope note. It's just an aside, and then you move on. But yeah, I don't think it helps to bludgeon people with, technical terminology. It's not going to bring anybody in.